When I first walked into the glass tower of Franklin and Myers, the law firm where I had just been named senior partner, I thought I had finally arrived at the place I'd dreamed of since law school. Years of late nights, endless case files, and countless battles in court had finally paid off. My name was on the partnership board now, my office had a view of the skyline, and the recognition I'd craved for so long was finally mine. But success, as I would soon learn, often comes with shadows lurking behind the applause. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. At home, life was supposed to be stable, a place of rest after the storm of trials and depositions. My husband, Marcus Wynn, was there, my partner of 7 years, a man I believed had once truly understood me. And then there was Veronica, my mother-in-law, who had moved in 6 months earlier after breaking her hip in what everyone in the family called a bad fall. The arrangement was presented as temporary, just until she recovered. Yet Veronica had settled into the house like she owned it, her sharp eyes and sharper words following me through every room. At first I told myself it was natural. After all, she was Marcus's mother, and family looks after one another. I tried to convince myself that it was an act of love, that Marcus was simply being a good son, that opening our home was a gesture of kindness. But it didn't take long before the small irritations began to feel like something else. Veronica never missed a chance to criticize, whether it was the way I dressed for court, the hours I spent working, or the meals I managed to throw together on the nights I was too exhausted to think straight. She watched me constantly, her lips pursed in disapproval, as though she were evaluating every move I made. Marcus, for his part, seemed to encourage it, though not openly. He would laugh lightly when his mother scolded me, or he'd say things like, "She only means well, Lena. Don't take it personally." But I did take it personally. How could I not, when the woman scrutinized even the way I loaded the dishwasher, as if every mundane detail of my life was proof of my incompetence? And how could I not notice the way Marcus's smile lingered on her, the way his attention shifted so easily away from me and onto her every need? The truth was, beneath the surface of what was supposed to be family support, something darker simmered. There was tension that I couldn't quite name, an unease that seemed to seep into the walls of the house. At night, lying awake beside Marcus, I would stare at the ceiling and wonder why the comfort of home felt more like a cage. Why did I feel watched, judged, and slowly suffocated by the very people who claimed to love me? I didn't know it then. But those early feelings, the weight of Veronica's stare, the chill in Marcus's laugh, the constant pressure to appear perfect, were warnings, red flags waving in the corners of my vision, signs that something was deeply wrong. The morning it happened began like so many others, quiet, almost ordinary, with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft patter of Veronica's slippers moving down the hallway. I was seated at the dining table, my laptop open, reviewing notes for a deposition later that week. The smell of toast lingered in the air, and outside, the sun had just started breaking through the blinds in thin, golden stripes. It should have been peaceful, the kind of morning that gave you a little energy before the storm of the day. But peace wasn't something I had felt in a long time. Marcus appeared from the kitchen carrying a mug of coffee, steam curling above the rim. "Here you go, honey," he said, setting it down in front of me with a flourish that felt almost rehearsed. His smile was wide, maybe too wide, the kind of smile you give when you're hiding something or when you've practiced it in the mirror. I blinked at him, trying to place why that smile made my stomach twist. I had seen it before, too many times. It was the same grin he'd worn when he told me, months ago, that my promotion was just luck, that I shouldn't let it go to my head. It was the same expression that lingered on his face at the hospital after I'd spent days curled up in agony, the doctors scratching their heads and muttering about food poisoning. That smile had become a mask, and behind it I sensed something sharper, something that didn't belong in a marriage. "Thanks," I said cautiously, wrapping my hands around the mug. It was warm, solid, comforting in a way, but my comfort didn't last long. I lifted the cup slowly, the way you do when you're distracted but still trying to show gratitude. But before the rim touched my lips, a faint scent hit my nose. Sweet at first, almost inviting, but then something else crept in underneath. Bitter, sharp, wrong. It was like a memory exploding from the back of my mind, pulling me 15 years into the past. Chemistry class. Sophomore year. Professor Klein had held up a vial and spoken in that serious, deliberate tone he used whenever he wanted to scare us into remembering something important. Cyanide has a distinctive smell, he had said. Some of you will never detect it. Others, well, consider yourselves unlucky if you can. Bitter almonds. Never forget that. And I hadn't. The moment the scent reached me, I froze, the world around me narrowing to that single cup in my hands. My heart thudded against my ribs, each beat echoing in my ears. My breath caught as realization settled over me, cold and merciless. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked. He was watching me too intently, his eyes not on my face but on my mouth, as though waiting for the sip, waiting for the swallow. His hands rested on the table, clenched tight, the knuckles pale. I forced a smile, pretending to be casual, though my pulse was racing. "Just a little hot," I murmured, setting the mug back down. I glanced toward the doorway, where Veronica stood with her arms folded, lips pressed thin in that perpetual expression of disapproval. "It's getting cold," she said sharply, her voice slicing through the air. "Marcus went to so much trouble to make it special for you." Special. The word landed like a stone in my stomach. I looked back at Marcus, who nodded slightly, his smile stretching tighter. "Drink up, Lena. You've been so tired lately. This will help." Tired. Yes, I had been tired. Too tired. For months I had felt drained, weak, plagued by nausea that came and went like the tide. The doctors had told me it was stress. Veronica had suggested I should step back from work, maybe even reconsider the partnership, for my health. Marcus had agreed with her every time, his concern a little too practiced, his encouragement a little too insistent. Now, staring at that steaming cup, the truth crashed into me. This wasn't stress. This wasn't some mystery virus. This had been deliberate. Someone Marcus had been making me sick. Slowly. Quietly. Poisoning me. Not enough to kill, but enough to erode me piece by piece. I needed to buy time. "I should use the bathroom," I said suddenly, rising from my chair. The words tumbled out before I could think too much. Marcus's face flickered just for a heartbeat, but I caught it. Panic. Then just as quickly, disappointment. He tried to mask it with a casual wave. "Of course, dear," he said, his voice strained. I walked down the hallway, each step heavy, my mind racing. Inside the bathroom, I locked the door and leaned over the sink, splashing cold water onto my face. My reflection stared back at me, pale skin, hollow eyes, weight I hadn't meant to lose. I pressed trembling fingers to my temples, forcing myself to breathe. 3 months ago, I had nearly died. I remembered lying in the hospital bed, Marcus at my side, Veronica fluttering around like a hawk pretending to be a dove. I remembered the way the doctors had dismissed it as likely food poisoning, though they'd never found the source. Now it all made sense. Those unexplained illnesses. The chemical receipt I'd found stuffed in Marcus's wallet, the one he'd brushed off with a laugh about photography supplies. The way Veronica had rifled through my laptop when she thought I wasn't looking. They weren't caring for me. They were orchestrating something. A performance meant to make me look unstable, fragile, too weak for the life I had built. And this coffee? It was the final act. I gripped the edge of the sink until my knuckles ached, then straightened. My instincts had saved me once before in the courtroom, when a single, overlooked detail had turned an entire case. They would save me again now. I couldn't ignore them. When I returned to the dining room, I found Marcus and Veronica leaning close together, whispering. They snapped apart the moment I stepped in, twin masks of innocence plastered across their faces. "Everything all right?" Marcus asked, his tone falsely light, his eyes scanning me for weakness. "Perfect," I said, lowering myself back into my chair. My voice sounded steady, though inside I was trembling. I picked up the mug again, holding it just below my lips, pretending to consider it. I could feel both of them watching me. Veronica's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Marcus's gaze bored into me with desperate anticipation. My instinct screamed at me not to drink, and I listened. But outwardly, I forced calm. I smiled faintly, shifting the cup in my hands. "You know, Veronica," I said casually, You look a little tired. Would you like some coffee? Marcus made plenty. Her expression softened for the first time in weeks. Veronica loved coffee, but Marcus rarely made it for her. I could see the temptation flicker across her face, the longing she tried to hide. Oh, I couldn't, she said, but her tone betrayed her. I insist, I said, rising to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest. It's the least I can do. Oh. In the kitchen, I opened the cabinet, found another mug identical to mine, and poured coffee from the same pot. This one smelled normal, warm, rich, nothing chemical hiding beneath. Then, with a careful hand and a steady breath, I carried it back to the table. What I did next was almost instinctive, smooth as if I had rehearsed it 100 times. While pretending to adjust my napkin, I switched the mugs in one fluid motion. The poisoned cup slid toward Veronica, while the harmless one rested in my hands. There you go, I said, my voice calm, steady. Veronica's face lit with genuine pleasure as she lifted the cup. Thank you, dear. Marcus, you should make coffee for your mother more often. And then I looked up, directly at my husband. The smile he gave me was no longer practiced, no longer forced. It was gone entirely, replaced by something raw, unfiltered, and unmistakable. Hatred. In that moment, every suspicion I had carried solidified into certainty. My instincts had not betrayed me. Marcus wanted me gone. I raised my mug, inhaled the safe, comforting aroma, and took a small sip. It was only coffee. But in that moment, it tasted like survival. As Veronica sipped the coffee that was never meant for her, my mind was already unraveling the threads of everything that had led me to this moment. I didn't just stumble into suspicion today, no. It had been building for months, hiding in the shadows of my memory, waiting for me to piece it all together. 3 months earlier, I had been lying in a hospital bed, my body racked with cramps so violent I could barely breathe. The fluorescent lights above me blurred as waves of nausea crashed over and over, each one worse than the last. The doctors hovered, muttering words like possible food poisoning and unknown source of toxins as they pumped fluids into my veins. They ran tests, so many tests, but nothing conclusive appeared. By the time I was discharged, pale and weak, the explanation was still a question mark. But I remembered the timing. The attack hadn't come after some random meal. It had come the night after I signed my partnership papers. The night Marcus had poured us both glasses of champagne and toasted to our future. At the time, I brushed off the coincidence. Stress could do terrible things to the body, I told myself. Stress plus bad takeout, it was an easy explanation. But now, sitting here with the almond bitterness still lingering in my nose, the pieces slid together with chilling precision. That night hadn't been chance. It had been the beginning. Marcus had always been ambitious, sometimes to the point of arrogance. When we first met in law school, I admired his drive. He was charming, clever, the kind of man who could walk into a room and have people listening within minutes. But ambition, when paired with resentment, curdles into something poisonous. By the time we were both climbing the ladders of our respective firms, I had begun to outpace him. I didn't plan it that way. I worked hard. I earned my wins, but I could see the way his smile faltered every time I brought home good news. Twice he had been passed over for partner at his firm. Twice he had watched as colleagues he considered less talented took the title he thought belonged to him, and then came my promotion. I still remember the look in his eyes when I told him how his congratulatory hug felt stiff, how his words of, "I'm so proud of you," didn't quite match the flicker of something darker beneath. Resentment. Pure and sharp. At the time, I ignored it. I wanted to believe marriage meant partnership, not competition. I wanted to believe Marcus's career struggles were just temporary setbacks. But somewhere deep down, maybe I already knew. Maybe I had already felt the chill in his smile, the way he watched me as if I were standing where he should have been. And then there was the receipt. It had been tucked inside his wallet, crumpled, as if he hadn't meant to keep it. A purchase from a chemical supply company. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding the slip of paper while he rummaged through the fridge. "What's this?" I had asked. My tone casual, but my heart already uneasy. He glanced over, then gave a short laugh. "Oh, that. I was looking into photography again. You know, chemicals for developing film. I frowned. Since when do you do film photography? Marcus shrugged, pouring himself a glass of water. I was thinking of starting. Haven't mentioned it yet. Thought it might be a hobby. Something creative. He was so smooth, so confident in his explanation that I almost let it go. Almost. Except, over the following weeks, no camera equipment appeared. No film, no lenses, no darkroom setup. Just the receipt, burned into my memory, like a warning sign I couldn't unsee. I remember telling myself I was paranoid, that marriages only work if you trust. And wasn't Marcus my husband? My partner? Wasn't he the one who sat by my hospital bed, holding my hand, telling me I'd get through it? But there had been something in his eyes back then, too, a flicker I couldn't name. Not love, not even fear. Something colder. Like a man watching a plan unravel. Now, in the dining room, watching him watch me, the truth was undeniable. The hospital. The receipt. The whispers with Veronica. The constant insistence that I was tired. Stressed. Unstable. This wasn't my imagination, this wasn't stress. Marcus had been poisoning me, piece by piece, eroding me from the inside out until I was weak enough to collapse under the weight of my own doubts. And Veronica, dear, ever-present Veronica, she had been part of it too. I thought back to her hovering presence, her sly comments. Maybe you should slow down, Lena, you're working too hard. Or, you don't look well. Perhaps you're not cut out for this kind of pressure. Always with that sharp gaze, that undertone of judgment disguised as concern. She had been reinforcing the story Marcus was trying to build. Lena the unstable wife, Lena the overworked lawyer cracking under the strain. It was gaslighting, plain and simple. They wanted me to doubt myself, to believe I was unraveling, until eventually the firm would too. And why? Because Marcus couldn't stand to see me succeed where he had failed. The realization was a knife twisting in my chest. The man I had once trusted with my life, the man I had stood beside through thick and thin, was plotting to erase me, to sabotage me professionally, to destroy me personally, and if today's coffee was any indication, to end me altogether. I looked at him across the table, his smile stretched too tight, his eyes still darting to the mug in Veronica's hands. The hatred that had flared in his face earlier was gone now, replaced by something harder to read, fear, perhaps, because I hadn't drunk, because Veronica had. Because his plan, so carefully laid, was beginning to fray at the edges. My hands shook slightly as I adjusted my napkin, but inside, something in me hardened. They had underestimated me. They thought I was too distracted by work, too exhausted by stress, too blinded by loyalty to see the truth. But I was a lawyer. Details were my weapon, instincts my shield. I had survived the hospital once already, and now I was staring the threat in the face, alive and alert. I remembered the weight of that receipt in my hand. The way Marcus had brushed me off, his voice dripping with false ease. I remembered the way Veronica had clicked her tongue at me the night before my promotion dinner, telling me I looked pale, asking if I was sure I could handle the stress of leadership. I remembered Marcus's words at the hospital. It was probably something you ate. Yes. Something I ate. Something he gave me. The past was no longer a blur of coincidence. It was a trail of evidence, each memory snapping into place like dominoes. And now, as Veronica drained the last of her cup, as Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, I realized the game had changed. They thought I was weak, but they were wrong. If there was one thing I learned in those months, it was that silence could be more suffocating than words. Veronica had a way of making her presence felt without ever needing to shout. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't throw tantrums. She simply hovered, like a shadow that stretched over every corner of my life, impossible to escape. It began innocently enough. Or at least that's what she wanted me to believe. One afternoon, as I stepped out of the shower, towel wrapped around me, I found her sitting at my desk in the study, my laptop open in front of her. My stomach dropped. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm, though the sight made my skin prickle. She turned in the chair, feigning surprise. "Oh, Lena, I was just checking my email. I couldn't get my password to work on my own computer." Her words were smooth, rehearsed, but her eyes flickered, darting away for just a second too long, and that's when I noticed. She hadn't even logged into her email account. The screen displayed my inbox, my calendar, my confidential case notes. I felt my throat tighten. "You could have asked me," I said, walking forward and shutting the laptop a little harder than necessary. Veronica's lips pursed, her trademark expression of disapproval. "I didn't want to bother you, dear. You're always so stressed, always so busy. It's not healthy." There it was again, that word. Stressed. She wielded it like a knife, cutting at me every chance she got. At first, I tried to shrug it off. After all, I was working long hours. The promotion came with added responsibility, and I often stayed up until midnight, preparing briefs or poring over deposition transcripts. Stress was part of the job. But Veronica wasn't pointing it out with concern, she was planting it, weaving it into a narrative. Every conversation circled back to how fragile I was, how maybe I wasn't as strong as I thought. She'd say it at dinner while pushing food around her plate. "Lena, you look pale again. Perhaps you should cut back at the firm before it takes a toll." Or in the mornings, while watching me gather my things. "You're shaking. Hands shouldn't tremble like that unless something is wrong inside. Maybe it's nerves. Maybe your mind is overwhelmed." And Marcus backed her every time. He would nod, offer me a soft pat on the shoulder, and echo her words. "She only means well, Lena. You should listen to her. You've been pushing too hard." It was insidious, subtle enough that if I repeated it to anyone else, it might sound like ordinary concern. But to me, trapped in that house with both of them reinforcing the same story, it became a constant drumbeat. "You're tired. You're stressed. You're unstable." There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they were right. The nausea, the fatigue, the headaches. What if it really was my body breaking down under pressure? What if I wasn't strong enough to handle the life I had built? Doubt crawled into my bones, and I hated myself for letting it in. But then I would remember the coffee, the almonds, the hospital, the receipt. Each memory burned away the fog just enough to keep me anchored. This wasn't all in my head. It was being fed to me, spoonful by spoonful, like poison itself. One evening I returned home late from court to find Veronica in the kitchen, reorganizing the medicine cabinet. Pill bottles lined the counter, some of them mine prescriptions I'd never even finished. "What are you doing?" I asked sharply, setting my bag down. She glanced up, all innocence. "Oh, I thought it might help if I organized things." "You take so many medications, dear. It must be hard to keep track." I froze. "I don't take that many." Well," she said, tilting her head. "You've been prescribed so many recently. Antacids, anti-nausea pills, even sleeping tablets. Doctors don't just hand those out unless they see a problem. It's nothing to be ashamed of, Lena. Everyone has their breaking point." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to scream. Those pills had been prescribed during my hospital stay, when no one could figure out what was wrong. But the way she framed it, as though my medical records were proof of fragility, made me feel cornered. "Thank you," I muttered, sweeping the bottles back into the cabinet myself. My hands trembled not from weakness, but from fury. Later that night, I caught Marcus and Veronica whispering in the living room. They stopped when I walked in, but not before I heard the words, "She's getting worse. Getting worse." I stood frozen in the doorway, watching them exchange a glance, one that spoke volumes. Veronica with her pursed lips, Marcus with his weary sigh. A mother and son united in their script. That was when I realized this wasn't just Veronica being overbearing or Marcus being unsupportive. It was deliberate. Coordinated. They weren't simply observing me. They were constructing me, shaping how I was perceived, how I perceived myself, gaslighting me into believing I was unraveling so that when I finally broke, no one would question it. The next day at work, I noticed my colleagues giving me wary looks. One of the junior associates asked if I was feeling better. Better from what? When I pressed him, he stammered that Marcus had mentioned I'd been under a lot of strain lately. My stomach dropped. Marcus was taking their lies outside the house, seeding them into my professional life. That night, when I confronted him, his face hardened. I was just worried about you. People can see you're not yourself. Don't you think it's better to get ahead of the story than let them wonder? Story. He used the word like this was a narrative he was controlling. I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but I knew he would only twist it back on me. That was the pattern. I accused, he soothed. Veronica reinforced. A cycle designed to make me doubt my own sanity. But I wasn't insane. I was awake now. The next morning, I sat at the dining table pretending to read case notes while Veronica bustled in the kitchen. Her movements were sharp, efficient, like a woman who thrived on control. She paused at my shoulder, glancing at the pages in front of me. All these late nights, she murmured. Are you sure you're not burning out? You don't want the firm to think you can't handle pressure. I forced myself to meet her gaze, to hold it steady. I can handle more than you think. Bah. For the first time, I saw something flicker in her expression, uncertainty. Just a flash, gone as quickly as it came, but enough to confirm what I already knew. She wasn't worried about me at all. She was worried that I wasn't breaking fast enough. I closed my laptop and stood. Thank you for your concern, Veronica. But I know my limits. Her lips tightened, but she said nothing. Inside, though, my resolve hardened. They thought they could script my downfall, paint me as unstable, erase me from the life I had earned. But I was a lawyer. I knew how to gather evidence, how to build a case, how to wait for the right moment. And I knew this much. They had underestimated me. What they didn't realize was that their surveillance, their whispered conversations, their constant accusations of stress, they weren't breaking me. They were giving me proof. Piece by piece, they were handing me the very rope I would use to hang them. The game wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The first time I admitted the truth to myself was not in a courtroom or in front of colleagues. It was in the bathroom, staring at my own reflection. I remember gripping the edge of the porcelain sink, my knuckles white, as the fluorescent light flickered above. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized, her cheeks hollow, her skin sallow, shadows etched beneath her eyes as if painted on by exhaustion itself. My once strong frame looked thinner than it had in years, clothes hanging off me like they belonged to someone else. My lips were cracked, my hands trembling faintly even when I tried to hold them steady. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed Veronica. I might have believed Marcus. That I was simply stressed, unraveling under the weight of my ambition, that my body was failing me because I had pushed too far, too fast. But I did know better. I could smell it in the coffee. I could feel it in the way Marcus watched me with those two bright eyes, waiting for me to falter. I could see it in Veronica's gaze, sharp and unyielding, like a prison warden monitoring a captive. I was being poisoned not just in body but in mind. And if I didn't act soon, there would be nothing left of me to save. I splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it grounding me, reminding me that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of fighting back. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, clarity cut through the fog. I had a choice. I could keep playing their game, swallowing their lies, letting them dictate the story of my supposed fragility, until eventually even I believed it. Or I could flip the script. I could gather the evidence, make my move, and remind them exactly who I was. Not a fragile woman unraveling, but a trial lawyer who had built her career dismantling lies. And that's when the plan formed. Simple, risky, but elegant in its own way. I dried my face, straightened my shoulders, and walked back to the dining room. Marcus and Veronica were still seated at the table, their conversation snapping off the moment I entered. Two conspirators caught mid-plot, trying to appear innocent. Marcus plastered on that smile again, the one I now recognized as a mask stretched thin across his hatred. Veronica gave me her usual once-over, eyes scanning for weakness. Everything all right, dear? Marcus asked, voice light but strained. Perfect, I said, settling into my chair. I reached for my coffee cup, holding it just below my lips, inhaling deeply. The bitter almond scent was still there, sharp and undeniable. My pulse quickened, but my expression remained calm. They wanted me weak. They wanted me to falter. Instead, I smiled faintly and shifted my gaze to Veronica. You know, you look a little tired. I said gently. Would you like some coffee? Marcus made plenty. Her face softened, almost imperceptibly, at the offer. Veronica loved coffee. I had seen her linger near the pot countless times, only to be waved off by Marcus, who rarely offered to make it for her. Oh, I couldn't, she said, shaking her head with a feigned humility, but her eyes betrayed her. They lit up, the longing clear. I insist, I said, standing, my tone warm, as though I were offering an olive branch. It's the least I can do. Marcus's eyes flickered with something dark alarm. He leaned forward slightly, his mouth opening as though to protest, but then he caught himself. To object would be to reveal too much. Instead, he forced another smile, though his jaw tightened. My heart was pounding as I walked into the kitchen, but my movements were steady. I opened the cabinet and found another mug identical to mine, the kind Marcus and I had picked out together years ago, back when our marriage had still felt like a partnership. The irony wasn't lost on me. I poured coffee from the same pot he had used earlier. This time, the aroma was normal, rich, dark, warm, no trace of almonds, no chemical undertone. Just coffee, pure and untainted. Carrying the mug back to the dining table, I felt the weight of their eyes on me. Every step was measured, deliberate, as though I were walking a tightrope suspended over an abyss. I set the fresh cup in front of Veronica with a smile. There you go. She beamed, genuine gratitude softening her sharp features for once. Thank you, Lena. That's very thoughtful. And then, in one fluid motion, I made the switch. While adjusting my napkin, I slid my original cup, the poisoned one, across the table toward her, replacing it with the harmless coffee now in my hands. The move was smooth, natural, practiced by years of courtroom theatrics, where sleight of hand and timing could dismantle an opponent's argument. There you go, I said again, as if nothing had changed. Enjoy. Veronica lifted the cup eagerly, inhaling the steam, and took a long, satisfied sip. Her eyes closed briefly, savoring the taste. Delicious, she murmured. I raised my own mug, inhaling deeply. This time the scent was pure. I took a careful sip, letting the warmth spread across my tongue. Just coffee, nothing more. Nothing less. Across the table, Marcus was watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His smile had vanished. What remained on his face was something raw, unfiltered, pure hatred. Anna, he said slowly, his voice careful, measured. Why don't you drink a little more? You said you were tired. Oh. I met his gaze, unflinching, and took another sip of the harmless brew. I am tired, I said softly. But this coffee tastes wonderful. Veronica, meanwhile, continued drinking, oblivious. She even laughed lightly, turning to her son. Marcus, you should make coffee more often. This is perfect. His complexion had gone pale, his eyes darting between us. For the first time, I saw fear in him, not for me, but for what he realized was happening. I leaned back in my chair, the cup warm in my hands, my heartbeat steady now. For months, I had been on the defensive, second-guessing myself, drowning under their manipulation. But in this moment, I wasn't weak. I wasn't unraveling. I was in control. I had made my decision, and there was no turning back. Inside, I knew this was only the beginning. Veronica's cup would reveal more than any argument or suspicion ever could. And Marcus would soon learn that underestimating me was his greatest mistake. The poisoned coffee sat in her hands now, no longer my burden to bear. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. For a few minutes, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Veronica cradled the mug between her hands like it was a gift, sipping it with a kind of delight I hadn't seen on her face in months. She closed her eyes as though savoring the warmth, the rich flavor, the small luxury she rarely received from her son. This is delicious, she said, beaming at Marcus. What's your secret? Marcus didn't answer. His eyes were locked on her, wide and unblinking, his jaw tight. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, memorizing every twitch, every flicker of panic he tried so hard to suppress. I lifted my own cup, inhaling the harmless scent, and took another small sip. The coffee was dark, smooth, clean. It tasted like freedom. Veronica drank deeply, her satisfaction written across her features. Half the cup was gone in less than 5 minutes. I sat back, calm on the outside, though my heart raced beneath my ribs, waiting. It didn't take long. First came the subtle tremor. Her hand shook as she set the mug down, porcelain clattering softly against the saucer. She frowned, glancing at her hand as though surprised by its betrayal. "Are you all right?" I asked, feigning concern, leaning slightly toward her. I don't know," she murmured, her voice thin, fragile. "I feel strange, hot, dizzy." Her cheeks flushed crimson, and her breaths grew shallow, uneven. She clutched at the edge of the table as her body betrayed her further. Muscles jerking with small spasms she tried desperately to control. "Mom?" Marcus's voice cracked. He half rose from his chair, his composure shattering. She gasped, one hand pressed to her chest. "Marcus, something's wrong." And then it happened. Her body convulsed violently, knocking the chair back as she collapsed to the floor. Her head hit the hardwood with a sickening thud. She lay there writhing, foam bubbling at the corners of her mouth, her limbs jerking in uncontrolled spasms. "No!" Marcus screamed, scrambling to her side. His hands fluttered uselessly over her body, as if he could will the poison away. "Mom! Stay with me, Mom!" I remained seated, my phone in my hand, my expression carefully composed. On the inside, adrenaline surged like wildfire through my veins, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was the moment. Marcus's face contorted with anguish, his panic spilling over, and then, in his desperation, the truth slipped free. "You weren't supposed to drink that!" he cried, his voice breaking. "It was for Lena." The words hung in the air, sharp and damning. His confession, his mask ripped away in one reckless moment. I exhaled slowly, steadying my hand as I dialed 911. My voice was calm, clear, almost detached as I gave the operator our address. "My mother-in-law has been poisoned," I said, glancing down at Veronica's convulsing body. "Cyanide. She drank coffee laced with cyanide." Marcus's head snapped up, eyes wild, his face pale as chalk. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fear. "I'm calling for help," I said evenly, meeting his gaze. "Something you clearly weren't planning to do for me." He lunged toward me, grabbing my wrist with bruising force. "Anna, wait!" "Don't!" I snapped, yanking free. "I understand perfectly. You've been poisoning me for months, little by little, just enough to make me sick, just enough to make me doubt myself. You wanted everyone to think I was unstable, breaking down under the pressure of my promotion. You wanted the firm to reconsider and take it away from me, hand it to you instead." His mouth opened and closed, words failing him. For the first time, Marcus looked small, weak, caught. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." But it was. It was exactly like this. On the floor, Veronica groaned, her breaths ragged, her body jerking in smaller and smaller spasms. Marcus tried to cradle her, tears streaming down his face. "Mom, please stay with me," he begged, his voice raw. I watched him crumble, watched the weight of his own ambition and cruelty drag him down. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like the powerless one. "You both underestimated me," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. "You thought you could make me doubt my instincts. You thought you could make me disappear. But you forgot I notice details. I don't ignore evidence. I build cases from fragments." He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and sweat, his eyes wild with disbelief. You switched the cups?" "Yes," I said simply. "Because I trusted myself. And because I knew the two of you too well." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Marcus's head whipped toward the window, panic flaring anew. He tried to speak, to explain, to twist the story back into his control, but the words wouldn't come. His mother convulsed once more, then fell frighteningly still. The front door burst open minutes later, paramedics rushing in with bags of equipment, their movements efficient and urgent. They worked quickly, checking Veronica's pulse, prying open her mouth, administering oxygen. But I saw the looks they exchanged, the subtle shake of one medic's head. It was too late. One of them glanced up at me. "What did she ingest?" "Cyanide," I answered without hesitation. The medic's brows shot up. "How do you know that?" "Because it was meant for me," I said, my voice firm. But I switched the cups. Behind me, Marcus let out a choked sob, burying his face in his hands. I stood there, phone still clutched in my hand, watching as the paramedics tried to pull his mother back from the brink, and I felt an odd sense of detachment. Months of torment, gaslighting, poisoning, all of it had led here. The truth wasn't a whisper in the dark anymore. It was shouted in Marcus's own voice, echoing through the house. It was for Lena. The world tilted, but this time it wasn't the nausea of poison or the weight of doubt. It was the dizzying relief of vindication. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't unstable. I was right. And they were caught. The sirens outside grew louder until the flashing red and blue lights spilled across our living room walls. The paramedics worked furiously over Veronica, but their faces had already betrayed the truth. She was slipping beyond their reach. They wheeled her toward the ambulance, one of them calling vitals, another checking her airway. I followed to the doorway, my phone still warm in my hand, and repeated the words that had been lodged on my tongue since the moment I switched those cups. "My mother-in-law has been poisoned with cyanide," I told the first police officer who stepped up onto our porch. My voice was calm, steady, detached as though I were giving testimony in court. "It was meant for me," the officer's brows furrowed. "How do you know it was cyanide?" "Because I can smell it," I said. "Bitter almonds. It was in my coffee. But I switched the cups. She drank it instead." Behind me, Marcus's strangled sob echoed through the house. "She wasn't supposed to drink that. It was supposed to be Lena." His own words, blurted minutes earlier in his panic, hung like a noose around his neck. The officer's eyes flicked past me toward Marcus, who was pacing the hallway, hair wild, hands shaking. Already he looked guilty. Already he looked undone. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. "I have evidence," I said firmly. My thumb scrolled through my gallery until I found the photo of the crumpled receipt, the one I had found in Marcus's wallet weeks ago. The purchase. Potassium cyanide. The date. Exactly 2 days before my sudden collapse that had landed me in the hospital. The officer took the phone, studying the image. "You've had this the whole time?" "Yes," I said. "And there's more. Over the past month, I had quietly gathered pieces of their conspiracy, fragments that had seemed paranoid even to me at first. Screenshots of emails I'd intercepted on our shared laptop messages between Marcus and Veronica, dripping with manipulation. "She's fragile. She can't handle this. We need to help her step back before she embarrasses herself." Their words framed as concern, but I knew better. They weren't helping me, they were setting the stage for my collapse. I had even forwarded some of the messages to my private account, just in case. Insurance, evidence, proof. One officer stepped aside, radioing dispatch, while another pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "Ma'am, we'll need all of this. The receipt. The emails. Anything you've saved. I'll cooperate fully," I said. And I meant it. Minutes later, a paramedic jogged back from the ambulance. He shook his head slightly at the officer nearest him. "She didn't make it." Pronounced at 9:47 p.m. The words fell heavy, even though I had expected them. Veronica was gone. Poison had claimed the woman who had helped orchestrate my slow unraveling. She had spent months monitoring me, gaslighting me, pushing the narrative of my supposed instability. And now, her own lips had delivered her to her end. Marcus collapsed into a chair, his hands clutching his hair, his sobs ragged. "No, no, no," he muttered. "She wasn't supposed to drink it. She wasn't—" He stopped abruptly, realizing too late how damning the words sounded. The officers moved in quickly. "Marcus Wynn, you're under arrest," one of them said, pulling his arms behind his back, snapping cuffs onto his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent." Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. He thrashed weakly, protesting. Wait. You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was an accident. I stood in the doorway watching him struggle and felt a strange calm settle over me. Months of doubt, fear, nausea, second-guessing it all crystallized into this single moment. The performance was over. The lies were exposed. The officers guided Marcus past me toward the waiting squad car. His eyes locked on mine, full of rage and desperation. You ruined everything. He spat, voice hoarse. No, Marcus, I said softly. You did. As the squad car pulled away, I exhaled, my body trembling with the release of tension I hadn't realized I was holding. Veronica was dead. Marcus was in custody. The walls of their conspiracy had crumbled in the span of an hour. But the work wasn't finished, not yet. At the station later that night, I gave my full statement. I laid everything out methodically, just as I would in court. The months of unexplained illness that coincided with my promotion. The hospital stay where no medical cause was found. The chemical supply receipt tucked into Marcus's wallet. Veronica's intrusion into my laptop, under the pretense of checking her email. The pattern of their whispered conversations, their constant insistence that I was stressed, unstable. And finally, Marcus's own confession. It was for Lena. The detectives listened carefully, taking notes, asking pointed questions. They examined the evidence on my phone. They promised to seize Marcus's devices, his so-called darkroom supplies, to confirm the presence of cyanide. By dawn, I was released. Exhausted, hollow, but free. Driving home alone, the city still quiet in the pale morning light, I replayed everything in my head. Veronica's watchful eyes, Marcus's cutting smiles, the nausea, the weakness, the endless chorus of "you're too stressed, too fragile, too unstable." All of it had been a carefully orchestrated lie. And yet, in the end, it wasn't me who unraveled, it was them. When I stepped into the house, the silence was deafening. The dining table was still set as though nothing had happened, 2 mugs abandoned in their places. One empty, one half-drunk, rim stained with foam. The poisoned mug. Evidence. A reminder. I picked it up carefully, holding it by the handle, and set it aside on the counter. Forensics would need it. But in that moment, I couldn't help staring at it. At the vessel that had been meant to end me, but had instead sealed their fate. Later that day, the news broke. Local channels ran the headline, "Lawyer survives alleged poisoning attempt. Husband arrested after mother dies." Reporters swarmed the courthouse, speculating on motives, digging into Marcus's career failures, his rivalry with me, his envy. I didn't give them a statement, not yet. I had no interest in public sympathy. Not when the real battle was still ahead. There would be a trial, and I intended to stand in that courtroom and tell the story myself, piece by piece, until there was no doubt left in anyone's mind. For now, though, I allowed myself one small victory. I made a fresh pot of coffee, poured it into a clean mug, and sat at the same table where Veronica had taken her last sip. The aroma rose around me, rich and warm, untainted. I lifted the cup to my lips and drank deeply. This time, the coffee tasted like survival. And for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. The trial came and went like a storm. I spent 3 full days on the witness stand, walking the jury through every detail, the unexplained illnesses, the chemical receipt, the emails between Marcus and Veronica, the smell of almonds in my coffee, and finally his own slip of the tongue. Piece by piece, I laid out the case like I had done 100 times before, except this time it wasn't just about my clients or abstract justice. This time it was my life on the line, my story, my truth. When the verdict was read guilty of murder and attempted murder, Marcus's shoulders crumpled. He was sentenced to life without parole. I thought I would feel triumphant, but what I felt instead was a deep, steady relief. For the first time in a year, I could breathe. I didn't let the shadows swallow me. 6 months later, I walked into a packed courtroom again, this time as lead counsel for a class action suit against a pharmaceutical giant. The case was brutal, the defense aggressive. But I was sharper than ever. I knew what it felt like to be gaslit, manipulated, pushed toward silence. And I knew how to fight back. When the jury awarded my clients $200 million in damages, the room erupted. Headlines called me one of the top trial lawyers in the state. I just thought of how close I had come to never standing there at all. 3 years later, I unlocked the doors to my own firm, Lena Tran, attorney at law. Beneath my name, engraved in smaller letters, were the words that had carried me through the darkest nights: trust your instincts. Clients often asked me about it, and I would smile, telling them instincts save lives as much as they win cases. On my desk sits a single object that I never put away, the mug from that night, the poisoned cup. I keep it not out of morbidity, but as a reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers don't come from strangers, but from those who sit across your dinner table, smiling while they slowly dismantle you. That survival isn't about never being targeted, it's about enduring, resisting, and rising stronger. Every morning, when I pour myself a fresh cup of coffee, I glance at it. And every morning, I remember that I am still here. That I was not destroyed. That I am more than what they tried to make me. The world will always have people who underestimate us, who mistake strength for arrogance, who try to reduce us to shadows of ourselves. But being targeted doesn't make you weak. Surviving does not make you broken. Surviving makes you unshakable. My coffee today tastes dark, strong, honest. Just the way I like it. Just the way I've become. When I look back at everything that happened, the greatest lesson I carry is the power of trusting myself. For months I was told I was just tired, just stressed, that my doubts were nothing more than paranoia. The people closest to me tried to convince me that my instincts were wrong, that I was unraveling. But deep inside, I knew something wasn't right. And that inner voice, the one we so often silence out of fear of being too sensitive or too dramatic, was the voice that saved me. Life has taught me that danger doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it comes from the people who claim to love us most. And yet, surviving betrayal showed me something deeper. Resilience is born not from never being targeted, but from standing back up when others try to break you. We cannot always control who seeks to undermine us, but we can control whether we let them succeed. My story isn't just about survival, it's about reclaiming strength, about learning that being doubted does not make us weak. Listening to our instincts, holding on to our truth, and refusing to surrender to someone else's lies, that is what makes us truly unshakable. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.